Great. Okay. Because I am so excited for this conversation, I'm going to get us started, and people can join in. But the first bit's just going to be me introducing us. Um, so thank you everybody for coming today. My name's Dulcie. I am one of the DataKind UK team, and I am just really excited to have this conversation around ethics and generative AI use, and very, very grateful to David, Alice, and Robin, who are willing to openly discuss this kind of thorny topic. So the provocation for today has really been for me, like, should we be using Gen AI right now? And if so, how? We know there's been, lots of coverage around the fact that there's risks and costs to the use of these tools. Um, and we're talking not just about ChatGPT, but all of the available Gen AI technology that's come out over the last couple of years. Um, but we know that creating these models required large copyright infringement. There's lots of environmental costs of the AI infrastructure needed to support these models. There's been concerns around like the training of these models, depending on the labor of workers with insufficient psychological support or potentially in global majority countries. And these are difficult problems to solve through just like a policy. It's something that I think requires active thinking. But on the same side, we've seen really, compelling and transformative use cases of Gen AI. And I've seen as well the argument that we owe it to our beneficiaries to help as many people as possible. So the goal for today is to have this open space with three thoughtful experts. We can hear from them about how they've wrestled with these questions of if and when and how to use Gen AI tools. So just a few housekeeping notes. The first 40 minutes are going to be some moderated questions, and we're going to hear from our three lovely panelists. And then the last 15 minutes roughly will be open to discussion. Please ask any questions you would like discussed in the Q&A function of the webinar, and I welcome others to upvote questions as well. That helps us see like what people are most interested in. We also welcome you to, as many people have done as well. This is great. Introduce yourselves in the chat, your name and where you're from. And just in terms of questions, I know this is a very weighty topic for many. I invite everyone to engage with, curiosity and openness and respect for diversity of views. Last piece of housekeeping is that we will be recording the session. For those who are unable to join today, we have closed captions enabled. If you have any other access needs or support needs, please message my colleague Nicole from the DataKind UK team, Nicole Holgate, and she will help you out. And the last thing that I'd like to do is just thank the team at Insight Infrastructure from Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who are partnering with us on this whole series that we've done around Gen AI use. So if you missed some of the earlier sessions, we've done some intro webinars, which you can find on our website about how these models work and some of the challenges. And we've also done a webinar around creating an AI policy. So with that, I'm just going to jump in and introduce our speakers. So we have three wonderful speakers today. We have Alice Kershaw. Alice is the head of digital transformation at the Royal Society of Wildlife Trusts. And there she leads the Federation's ambitious digital program, supporting its collective 2030 strategy to bring nature back. And in this role, she supports the 47 individual grassroots charities to make the most of digital. So I think she's quite busy with AI at the moment and help them with the strategic thinking and development of new services, including, I'm told, a new about to launch data service. So that sounds exciting as well. We have Robin Christopherson as well joining us from AbilityNet, where he's the head of digital inclusion, and he's one of the country's leading experts on accessibility and digital inclusion, and does a lot to raise awareness of the power and potential of technology to transform people's lives. He is blind himself and is a passionate supporter of products that are inclusive and help everyone by being easier to use. And for this work, he's been recognized with an MBE and featured in the UN's top 100 most influential people in digital government. So really thrilled to have him here as well. And last but not least, we have David Nolan, who's joining us from Amnesty Tech. So David is a senior investigative researcher at Amnesty Tech within Amnesty International. And he works at the intersection of technology, AI, and human rights across research policy and advocacy. And specifically, his research focuses on the deployment of AI and algorithmic systems by public sector agencies and big tech. So brings a really useful perspective to today's discussion. So thank you so much, David and Robin and Alice, for joining us today. Really, really happy to have you here. Um, Okay, so just to get started, I thought before we dive into, the specifics, it would be helpful to situate the situation a little bit, and perhaps each of you could share a little bit about how you and your organization are using Gen AI tools right now or not, and what some of the biggest challenges are that you've been wrestling with when choosing how and if to use those tools. So. Alice, do you want to start us off and then we can go around?
Of course. Thank you very much for having me here. Really, really appreciate it. It's definitely something we're wrestling with. So here at the Wildlife Trust Federation, we're looking at it predominantly the main use we're seeing of generative AI is around things to do with our conservation science. So assisting species detection with things like images, eDNA, tracking, like basically what's that thing in that camera trap? Let's give it a go, guessing at what it is with AI. We also look at things like generative AI as part of bigger pipelines that might include machine learning around habitat condition detection, things like that, data workflows, use of it in coding around statistical analysis, but also some of the more kind of general use around kind of summarizing meeting notes, sometimes using it for a bit of ideation, things like that. And we're also aware that some of the tools that we use as standard have it built in terms of kind of prompting us about how we use it. So that's how we're using it within the Wildlife Trust Federation. It's broad. First thing to say is we are a federation of independent legal entities and independent charities. So we don't have a kind of full consensus. We have some very shared concerns around things such as hallucinations and how they might impact on public trust around us as a charity. We also have obviously the kind of wider environmental impact, both the kind of physical data centers and what they might mean, as well as the impact around climate misinformation and how that might be used. We're already seeing it with things like fake videos of animals showing kind of nature misinformation on a regular basis. So it's a very I was going to say spicy topic of discussion at the moment, and we have everything from trusts who are just saying no, we won't touch it with a barge pole, through to kind of trusts that want to be very curious about it. And our overall kind of policy is basically kind of cautious but curious. Probably phrases is the phrase we're using.
Thank you. Yes, I can imagine navigating this across one organization is hard enough, but across 47 is even more difficult. Um, I'll pass to Robin next to hear about your experience at AbilityNet.
Great, thanks. So, yeah, I'm glad Alice went first because she's kind of covered the things that, we're all using AI for every day. As a technology and disability charity, we're obviously very closely investigating how we should be using AI to deliver our services, our free services to disabled individuals or older people more efficiently, more effectively. We've only got 450 odd volunteers around the country, which is fantastic, going into people's homes, etc. But at the same time, there are a lot more people out there that we could and would hopefully be able to support. And so there's a lot of scope there. We have commercial services because, like every charity, you have to be a commercial beast these days to survive. And how can we deliver those more effectively and efficiently? Again, are code auditing, we're doing diverse user testing, so there are humans definitely in the loop. Will we be able to, I don't know, do some of the diverse user testing with AI as well as the code audits, etc., as like a first level screening, and then sign off with human input on a much more kind of cost effective basis so we can reach more people who couldn't necessarily afford the sort of human-driven consultancy. We've got a fantastic resource called mycomputermyway.com. Have a look. It auto detects the OS that you visited it on, and it will give you the guide pages and step-by-step guides of how to get the most out of your operating system and common apps from an accessibility point of view. And we would strongly recommend every single one of you on this call today to have a play in the accessibility settings on your computer, on your phone, because nobody should settle for an out-of-box kind of vanilla experience. We're all very different, and we should really have a play there. Me personally, as a blind person, I also use the camera with AI, not to catch wildlife, although I could easily do that. The camera could be on my sunglasses here. These are the Meta Ray-Ban glasses. There's a little camera there in the corner, and I can be walking along and I could say, hey, Meta. She hasn't connected yet, so I better quit while I'm ahead. I could say, hey, Meta, and then it would, what's in front of me? Are there any obstacles on my path? Why is the dog not able to go forward? That might be a van parked on the pavement, or it could be a massive hole where the rails, the hoarding that is protecting it has blown over or disappeared or whatever it might be. So it could literally be a lifesaver for me. And I would use it for snapping pictures of mail or of signage or whatever it might be. And it will obviously do a really good job of telling me what that is. So yeah, we've got a standing committee in AbilityNet to really investigate how we can best use AI internally and externally. And I should say we're also on a working group called AI for C, AI for Charities. I don't know if you guys are aware of it. It's a brilliant group. Everyone can join. And they have quarterly meetings where loads of charities showcase how they're using AI very effectively in delivering their services, AI for C.
Thank you. That's super helpful to hear both about your kind of professional and personal experience. Yeah, definitely encourage folks to join the AI for C community, and CAST as well. Have a digital leads network, which has an AI peer group as well. Both great opportunities to learn from others and see how people are thinking and experimenting with tools and some of their challenges. That's really helpful. And then finally, David. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience at Amnesty, and or if you're not using it directly, like some of the challenges that you think of for others in the sector?
Thanks so much, Dulcie, and thanks so much, Robin and Alice, for this really useful and excellent opening reflections. Can everyone hear me okay? Sorry, sometimes my mic. Okay, great. So I think the main thing to take away from our side, and just to kind of situate where we're coming from, particularly within Amnesty Tech, is Amnesty Tech very much focuses on policy and human rights work. So we work at the intersection of technology and human rights. So I can talk a little bit to the kind of how Amnesty has approached the adoption of Gen AI, and I'm very much coming from the angle that we are the policy people within that conversation, and I'll be speaking to that perspective where we represent the kind of policy stakeholder within that group. So Amnesty set up a working group in 2023, quite late in 2023, that kind of ChatGPT moment where obviously the technology was existed before but really blew up in that moment. And since then, there's been kind of cross-collaboration leadership, IT playing a leading role, Technology and Human Rights Program, our Language Resource Center, representatives from various country-level teams around the world, research methods team, who might use AI to do within their kind of research methods. So it's quite a wide group with a diverse group of stakeholders within it. And this has been quite a long journey for Amnesty to workshop an internal policy together. We're just getting to that point at the moment. Until then, within Amnesty, there's been a moratorium on the use of generative AI within external outputs. But this policy is just being finalized and is coming into effect very soon. So I can speak to some of those points. In terms of key challenges for us, in particular at Amnesty Tech, it's marrying our external policy calls, our human rights analysis of technologies, in particular generative AI, with kind of internal use and the acknowledgement that other folks from within the organization might see the opportunities that generative AI presents, and the kind of pragmatism that this technology does exist, and people may use it. I think the big thing for us is that we cannot be misaligned. We really have to walk the walk as an organization. If we have policies on and human rights analysis of how specific technologies are built, the supply chains that are involved in their development, then we really need to be quite careful about how we might use them within our work. I just want to point to, I think Rob and Alice both mentioned this, that we also have to acknowledge as an organization that many of these tools are now integrated within the day-to-day IT service offering that many organizations will draw from. Large tech companies have huge market dominance. And when they integrate generative AI tools from Copilot, other things like this, we have to accept that they have chosen to do that as a company, and obviously the majority of organizations will be using a suite of services from one of the large tech companies within their day-to-day activities. So within our policy, we have drawn a distinction between kind of discrete uses of generative AI. That might be, for instance, as I think both Rob and Alice mentioned, uses within kind of research versus kind of integrated AI, which comes with the day-to-day service offering and the IT that we all use day-to-day.
Thank you. That's super interesting. And again, I'm really grateful to have like these three very diverse perspectives. I think you've all wrestled with very, in some ways, similar challenges, but also the different lenses that different sectors bring. David, I wanted to pick up on something that you said. You already kind of touched on what I was hoping to kind of get to next, which is you mentioned this tension between having to like walk the walk with what you say in terms of your advocacy work and then the day-to-day use of these tools. I guess my question is, do you think that organizations who are trying to advance social justice can uphold those values and still use Gen AI tools? There is an inherent tension. Is there a way to do this? And this is not going to be your answer for life. It's your answer for today.
Yeah,
I know it's
a
a
really
challenging
interesting question. One of which I might dodge answering myself right now. I think I can talk around some of the points within it. I would say on a personal note, I actually do not use generative AI within any of my work. That's just a personal preference. And there's lots of research, as a researcher, there's now lots of research coming out around the use of generative AI to kind of outsource your thinking and things, that the deterioration of skills that might come as a result of that. So just a personal preference for myself is that I actually do not use generative AI at all. I think, returning to a question of whether it's ever ethical to use, I think I can't answer that question directly. I think what we can talk about is the kind of framing that we use to think about generative AI. As I mentioned in my kind of opening statement, the supply chain framing is absolutely critical for us in our human rights analysis on generative AI tools. And we believe it's the only way to take a holistic view of AI's impacts, to understand the kind of root and structural drivers of generative AI's impacts on society. So just to kind of discuss a few of those that I'm sure many in the audience will already be aware of. There's obviously the environmental concerns, the astronomical numbers on water usage from just one search. There's the labor implications and the exploitative supply chains and the data annotation that is often outsourced to many to workers in countries in the global majority. There's the inherent privacy concerns of generative AI. Many of them rely on kind of web scrape data that's been ingested into their systems. So I think we try and take all of these things together to think about red lines. And one of those, just to give an example, is largely avoiding all use of kind of audiovisual content, particularly in a way that it depicts human beings and some of the pitfalls that we've seen with generative AI and the inherent kind of bias and discrimination around the production of audiovisual content. So that's just one red line that just to kind of give an example, but this is the kind of framing that we are using to kind of build out our position. We also accept that many people will be very excited about the offering day to day, and that there are opportunities which I'm sure others on the panel can speak to. But particularly in terms of accessibility, is one such use case that I would like to highlight. So I think there needs to be a balance, and what I would say is, yes, I haven't answered the question directly, but I think there needs to be some level of thinking around risk appetite, a willingness for an organization to learn as we go, make mistakes, but also, for us as Amnesty, maybe take quite a cautious approach and a more preventative approach until a policy is absolutely finalized. And this kind of mirrors, us as Amnesty Tech, as kind of advocates on technology and human rights, our calls to kind of regulate the industry before the technology is built and implemented, which is something that we haven't seen to date, because it's much easier to implement preventative solutions rather than kind of checking and fixing errors after the fact and use.
Thank you, and thank you for also being first. It's honestly such a difficult question, and really appreciate the framework and like some of your thoughts around like red lines. I wondered if I might come to you next, Robin, because you might ask the inverse question, I suppose, which is, are we obliged to use these tools? So I just wonder your thinking on this. Some might argue that to advance social justice, we must use these tools. So what's your thinking on this thorny question?
Absolutely. So technology has always been like a really powerful tool, like the ultimate tool to level the playing field, to overcome the challenges that disabled people have on a daily basis at home and at work. So then AI came along and it became like the most, times 10, basically. So we definitely feel like we have an obligation to maximize the benefits of AI, both in our service delivery and for our stakeholders, whilst minimizing some of the issues that that David's been talking about around bias and prejudice. And I'd love to talk about that a little bit later on. But I guess what I'd like to focus on in this particular response is the inherent obligation on our part to respect the privacy of the data of our stakeholders. So we obviously, our stakeholders are very vulnerable people. The sensitive data that we hold on them, is something we need to really value and think about. So if you are going to be using AI, for example, to create an expert chatbot to help deliver some of your services, there are lots of different platforms out there that can help you build those. And they vary in how much they respect the privacy and whether that data is sent off for training purposes and could surface elsewhere. So that's really, really important to remember. So always choose that carefully. And obviously we would say, make sure that the platform or the tool that you're using will create an accessible chatbot UI as well for the user. With regards internally, then, you're going to have employees using say ChatGPT, for example. You absolutely are. Even if your policies say you won't use ChatGPT and you've banned that, you've blocked that URL from your network, people will just use it on their phones. So how many of us are using Copilot, the really expensive £25 per user tier, which you need to have an E3 or E5 business Office 365 account already. So that can be prohibitive for us in the third sector. So, people are going to be, all my colleagues are using ChatGPT on a daily basis, as I am. It's just too good at what it does. And when David was saying, we need to think about skill wastage or, over-reliance, I can absolutely see that, because it always does a better job in a fraction of the time than I would have created. And I've been in this space for 29 years now, so I think I do quite a good job, but it's just so good. So really practical things you can mention to your employees. So yeah, if you're not using Copilot, which does respect all of that data, that never leaks out, regardless of what you put in, or the fact that it has access to all of the knowledge graph within your organization, in Teams, in SharePoint, OneDrive, that sort of thing. So if you can't afford Copilot, make sure that all of your users are logged in to ChatGPT. So not using it logged out, create a free account, you don't have to pay for it, and then you have access to its settings. So if you go into settings, then you can go to the account drop down, then you can go to settings and data controls. And in there, you can turn off this improve data for everyone. Improve the model for everyone. Sorry, I'm listening to my notes. So yeah, in the data controls in your settings in ChatGPT, improve the model for everyone. Turn that off. Absolutely turn that off. It's not off by default. If you just do that simple thing, tell your employees to do that, then none of your text, voice, or video interactions with ChatGPT will go anywhere else towards the training model or leak out of that particular account. So yeah, I would strongly recommend something as simple as that. We're in not damage limitation mode, but we're absolutely in managing the use of AI, not use it. You cannot expect your employees to not use it. So yeah, really important. And that's it, I think, for me.
Thank you, Robin. That's super helpful. And I popped in the chat as well a recent article about that exact topic about how even if you don't have an AI policy, your staff are probably using it. So to get ahead of that a little bit, I imagine Alice can touch on that as well. Okay, so coming to Alice now, we've heard kind of two different sides. I imagine you've wrestled with this question, particularly with some of the concerns around Gen AI's intensive climate impacts. And so I wonder like how if you and more broadly maybe others within the wildlife trusts have thought about Gen AI use and whether you can like how you hold the value around environmental usage and these tools, like how you balance that if there's a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's obviously the environmental impact is certainly a consideration, but so are a lot of the other impacts as well, such as I know there's a question we'll probably come to later around bias, but things around kind of what's in that training data, how much we can trust it, how much it conflicts with our EDI, sorry, aspirations as well, I think is something that's quite key. So we've kind of had quite a lot of conversations, and we started our conversations 3 years ago when ChatGPT kind of launched their initial, hey, you can talk to this like it's a human being chatbot, and everyone got very excited about it, with talking about responsible AI. That was the first point we got to. And there's a real mix, once again, across Federation. Well, for example, we have some trusts who are very keen to try it out and kind of have a bit more, be quite open with staff of like, here, we'll get you some co-pilot licenses. We really want you to try it out. And then we want to come up with our policy. And we want to have a bit of a kind of discussion, see where you are when you know a little bit more about how it works and what it can do. And then there's others who are just not touching it. So we're kind of, a lot of it is working through individual policies and strategies for individual trusts. We also have an overarching, what's called a briefing note, which kind of pulls together our kind of consensus on kind of what we're going to use it for, what we're not going to use it for. There is some consensus there. For example, full video generation is not something that we would be doing for various reasons. So we have a number of things where we actually will, for example, during recruitment, it can't replace people-based decision makings. It won't replace any decisions that have a significant impact on people or wildlife. Once again, handling personal sensitive data, those kind of things. Some of it, though, is so there's the kind of big considerations about it. There's also the emotional impact on staff when you're dealing with technology that conflicts with your values and ethics, especially in a highly values-driven organization. So we also have had discussions around people shouldn't be forced to use it, but there also, we need to create a situation where you're not going to be judged for using it or judged for not using it, because that's going to make people feel like emotionally unsafe. So a lot of the kind of guardrails and guidance we're putting in on a kind of really like base level around, be aware that it can sometimes say things that aren't true. So always have a human in the loop or ground truthing if it's citizen science, be secure with it. Kind of like Robin's great advice of like, yeah, toggle off the kind of training data on it, make sure that we put these systems in place as safe as possible, help our kind of staff in the bigger picture way of, tech should be supporting their work. We're trying to solve some of the knottiest problems around people, habitat, species, actions for nature. Like we need to try and use as many tools as possible. We want staff to feel safe and secure while doing that as well and not in conflict with their values. So that's certainly something that we're also thinking through. And so I do a number of workshops across the UK with Trust, bespoke to them about this to help them work out what kind of policies and strategies they need there. But then I also do overarching resources and information to kind of support that too, and signpost other things. Loads of, so the CAST work, some of the work going on with Third Sector in Scotland, some of the obviously DataKind UK stuff. There's loads of resources out there as well to support people too.
Yeah, definitely. And it sounds like there's been quite a lot of kind of cross organization discussions. I wonder if I could pick your brain specifically on the environmental concerns, and I guess like how you thought about that organizationally, because I don't work in this space. It's very hard for me to know when the benefits of a particular technology use for a particular question outweigh the particular environmental cost. Maybe you can, this is incredibly reductive, but save 10,000 trees by using 100, So how have you thought about the relative kind of environmental costs versus the potential benefits in the work that you're doing with the wildlife trusts?
I mean, it'd be a lot easier to have that thought if we had really clear open data on what the carbon and water and environmental impact is. We can get some, obviously, around kind of individual prompts, which appear to be relatively modest. The individual personal use of this kind of stuff is pretty small. Feels a little bit like a replica of when Shell tried to get everyone to map their own carbon footprints, so that it took away from the fact that the issue was the companies themselves doing it on a very big scale, which does lead towards a kind of legislative kind of approach to like the more kind of systematic look at this stuff rather than like it's not so much the individual use that gives people a lot of tension. Like I was saying, the kind of emotional tension does come in there where people feel guilty about using it, which is interesting because they don't feel guilty to the same degree. Or I'm never asked about like use of Teams or use of YouTube or any of that, which have very significant implications as well. I think because it's harder to see where the use of AI is truly beneficial, in the same way that we're having more of these conversations, and also because there's public discourse around this. So the first one is, as well, just one of our things is we want to see more transparency around the actual like what is going on here end to end, because obviously we've got the training data, we've got the individual use, we do have policy statements, for example, on things like data centers, independent of AI, around that. So for us, it's one where we have to work on the basis that it does have a climate impact. I've kind of mentioned two things. One being the like individual impact of the kind of the data centers and so on, and the prompting and all of that. The other one being the misinformation impact, which is slightly different. And we have to make sure that it's adding real value. It's also worth looking at some of the language models that we use are smaller models like Agouti and Conservation AI. So some of the ones I'm mentioning that are built into our kind of image identification ones are quote unquote smaller and more effective models. We're also looking at working with Loughborough University on a data waste protocol for our data service, which it's well worth looking at Loughborough's online information about data waste and data carbon for our own use of machine learning internally. So that's something we're very keen on, kind of making sure that anything we are using has that, but also being very clear that it has to provide a solid value and do something we can't do otherwise and save us significant time. Otherwise, it's just not worth it on any level, but it's certainly not worth it on an environmental level to start to consider it. It is a real it's a real knotty one, is the short version of years of conversation about this, because it's so untransparent. So the first thing is we would love to see more transparency, and then we can actually make real decisions based on the real impact. But at the moment, we have to go off the idea that it is presumably large, and therefore the value has to be consummate with that. So having a look at that alongside other ethical considerations that we've mentioned around kind of whether that's the right model, whether there's bias built into it, whether there's other things we need to consider around the risks of using those models in different contexts anyway, all of which has kind of come up in these conversations so far. But for example, doing equality impact assessments when we're bringing in these models, as well as kind of data protection impact assessments and those as well. So we're aware we're going like eyes in with risk assessments on using these. So I'm kind of not avoiding the environmental one. It's just hard to answer because we don't have a really good view of what it is. So, and also, I suppose it's worth saying the models are all becoming more effective and more efficient as they move on. It's in the best interests of the companies to make them so. Not that we trust them particularly, but I think that's also, they will become more effective, and there's probably other uses of AI in a more kind of local basis that we could do that would be more efficient, which is something we're definitely looking into more.
Super interesting. And I feel like there's a lot of kind of interesting follow-up questions. And I think you touched on something that I think is really important, that I think that as a sector we do need to advocate for better practices. And it's already had an impact, through, especially some of the work that the folks at Hugging Face are doing around advocating for better environmental data, and some of the work that Amnesty's done around advocating for decentralizing power from big tech. I don't know how we can how we can achieve that. I wanted to come back to sort of the opposite question, which is something that David touched on a little bit, and maybe we can start with Robin on this one. But David, we just talked about kind of like when benefits outweigh the risks. But David mentioned, that they have some red lines around when not to use these tools. And so, Robin, I just wondered if you also at AbilityNet had any red lines, or if you'd had any conversations about when the risks outweigh the benefits potentially.
I mean, as I said earlier, our AI has got such potential that we're more on the boomer side of the argument. There are three camps: Zoomer, Boomer, and Gloomer, and that it depends on whether you think Skynet is going to kill us all versus accelerate at all costs and don't hang the consequences kind of thing. So we're sort of definitely in the middle. Very optimistic about its potential, very aware of its downsides. Just on the environmental thing before I go back. So Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, arguably the biggest player, although the others are massive as well, said on the energy consumption, and obviously there are other concerns: water, labor, rare resources, that sort of thing. On the energy side, each query is on average an hour's worth of a microwave at medium power. So putting your microwave on for an hour at medium power, I don't know whether that chimes with Alice's kind of that it's not actually that much, but I was surprised that he actually came out with that. Now, that doesn't mean that every time you ask ChatGPT, for example, any query, it's going to be that, because average is also taking into account those times when I press that deep research option and it takes 45 minutes to come back with its answer. So, that's profligate use of resources versus a quick query. But in that same sort of paragraph, Sam Altman was saying, which is why we actually don't want you to thank ChatGPT, at the end, like, thanks very much, because that is, another however many, kilowatts of power or whatever it is. So yeah, that's really important. So, but going back to prejudices and biases, I think it's really, really important to know the downside. So, we must forge ahead with AI, but with our eyes open. So, for example, robot assessors in the recruitment process are being used, particularly with larger organizations, because they have a huge volume of applicants for a given vacancy. So they screen on the first stage or step of the process with a robot assessor. You join a video call. This is hugely problematic. However much the providers of these solutions have tried to build in guardrails to stem to stay the biases or to curb the prejudices and stereotypes that were built into the model, they're not very successful, because research has shown that you will be marked down with the color of your skin. So the darker your skin, the lower your score on these assessments. If you're a female, you'll be marked down. If you smile, you'll be marked up. So just bear that in mind. But if you're wearing glasses, you'll be marked down. If you have a hijab, you will be marked way down. Even if you have like a headscarf or an Alice band that looks a bit like a hijab, then you will be marked down. So yeah, there's really interesting research that has shown that these AI models are rife with the prejudices and biases that were existing or extant training. So yeah, now don't think that all LLMs are equally as bad. There are some, should I dare say, grok, which are created to be much more right-leaning and less accepting of diversity, etc. So they're not all created equal, but so choose wisely, but also test the heck out of the AI that you're going to be using for kind of function critical applications like that, because you may be significantly and in very real terms prejudicing people, because of your use of AI.
Definitely. And there's been some lots of different articles around different chatbots advising, for example, women to ask for like lower salaries when given advice around recruitment. There's been all sorts of visual challenges when people are like uploading photos and saying, can you make this into a professional photo? There's been cases where that's turned non-white people white, for example. They're just really awful things that, as you say, reflect the bias inherent in our society. Uh, which is a really kind of nice lead into this broader question around like bias in data, and not wanting to you know amplify that in our own work. So I wonder if David, you can speak to a little bit about some of the challenges you've been thinking about at Amnesty about the bias inherent in the training data and in some of these models, and if there's anything we can do about it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and just to say, I think Robin spoke so well on this and so exhaustively. I think when we try to kind of conceptualize AI systems within Amnesty Tech, we always try and take what we call a socio-technical view, which is a word some of you might be familiar with, but it's just an acknowledgement that any technology is an expression of the kind of structure that the kind of structural forces and structural dynamics within society at that moment in time. And as Robin so eloquently put, we've seen much of this mirrored in the outputs that come from many generative AI systems. So when applying this to our own work, if obviously I talked about red lines earlier in terms of producing audio visual content. This is one that's very, very concerning. If we were in a hypothetical case to try and use generative AI to produce any kind of campaigning or advocacy material, an acknowledgement that so much research has shown that there is bias and discrimination baked in, given the training data that many of these tools, or what we know of the training data of many of these tools, because it's not always transparent, or most of the time is not. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that. Not to move too far away from the question, but one thing that is very important for us as an organization, we're an international human rights organization. The law, international law is and goes back to some of the questions that you were touching on earlier, is an issue of factuality. We've obviously mentioned kind of hallucinations, and many people speak about them, and kind of the inclusion of adequate oversight, having a human in the loop to check these kind of things. But when thinking about a framework or trying to assess costs and benefits, it's very, very challenging and needs to be done on a case-by-case basis, particularly in high stakes context, and particularly when factuality is incredibly important, as it is. I would say many organizations work, but particularly when it comes to legal matters, factuality is very, very important. So I just want to highlight that as well, as an inherent risk to the use of generative AI tools, be that in research, be that in policy development. It is a risk that kind of needs to be thought about. I think the other things that I kind of wanted to touch on is some of the things that you can put in place as an organization. I talked a little bit about adequate oversight, and obviously Robin's mentioned kind of human in the loop, and I think getting that process right, if AI tools are to be used, is a huge challenge. Across my work and kind of the adoption of looking at the adoption of AI, into public service delivery, into kind of our day-to-day use of social media, across the board, it's very easy to kind of pay lip service to have a human in the loop, but what does that really mean? And what does that look, if done well, what does that actually look like in practice? And I think that is a really interesting question, which a lot of organizations, including us, are facing. I think the other thing that I would like to mention is kind of the building blocks when organizations are adopting AI that you can kind of put in place. So kind of monitoring and actually tracking usage, how much staff are using these tools and for what purposes, to really understand the lay of the land. And then impact assessments. I know Alice spoke about these in relation to kind of EIA, but I think it's really important to kind of build a series of impact assessments to vet new tools if they're going to be used within the organization. So these are just like some of the different blocks that you can put in place to try and like build out the process of to assess whether you think it's okay to use generative AI in certain contexts. And I think you need as many of these, particularly in high stakes contexts, as possible to kind of have that scaffolding in place that mitigates against many of the issues that we've kind of talked about with generative AI.
Thank you. That's super helpful. And perhaps we can circle back at the end to kind of closing thoughts on, how to get started in mitigating practices, because I think that could be really useful to folks. But I'm conscious that I promised some time for questions from the audience, and we already have a few. If you do have a question, please do pop it in the Q&A section of Zoom. It's sometimes hard for us to spot them in the chat, so please put them there if you can. I wanted to start with a question from Paul Buchanan, which touches on this question of like bias in training data, and something that Robin said around like let's make sure that we always turn model training off with our prompts. And so his question was if those of us working in the social value space are more cautious about using Gen AI and we don't feed in the training with our information or thinking of values, is this going to have any impact on the models of the future? Will those Gen AI models have less social value? Will they be more susceptible to bias? Could we potentially be increasing harm by not putting our values in? Yeah, David, do you have any thoughts on that to start us off? And then I'll open it up to Robin and Alice if you want to jump in too.
Sorry, I'm just pulling up the question. Social values. Social value space are more cautious about using Gen AI and not feeding the training with our info. It's a really interesting provocation. I think currently, whilst the models remain so opaque, it's very difficult to answer. And one thing I would point to is the sheer scale of content that's ingested into Gen AI models at the moment. So it is worth thinking about kind of the relative scale of perhaps if we are not using these tools, how much of the kind of total training data does that constitute if we were to remove it? Again, difficult to say, but we know they are trained on vast amounts of data, including kind of like scrape data from the internet, also whole libraries of books. So I think it's difficult to say if it would have an impact, and it's a really interesting question. But in terms of scale, it would. I feel it would probably represent quite a small proportion, so may not ultimately impact the output. But yeah, it's a really interesting question.
Could I jump in on this? Because I got asked this yesterday in a workshop, and my answer was slightly flippantly. My first answer was a less professional phrased version of that, which was, it's a bit like throwing a glass of water into the sea. And secondly, it was, well, if we want our data to be available to other people or machines, maybe there's ways to focus more on having open structured data sets, cleaner websites where our content is easier to find, and maybe getting stuff up onto like Wiki Commons. Like there's other ways which have wider benefits if we want AI to find this and use it and us to be confident in our data. So I was interested that question was asked here as well, because my overall feeling is no, I don't think we should be giving our training data for free to large companies.
Robin, yeah, did you have any thoughts on this question as well?
Yeah, so there are a number of organizations that are training LLMs. So the likes of OpenAI have open sourcing the weights of their models, and that's the important bit. That's the bit that took all of the work in the first place. So you've got this kind of neural network with all its connections and connectivity forged. It's like the brain, but it's empty. And then you can train it with your own cohort of data. So they are doing that, and they're kind of trying to be very selective, not just pointing at everything on the internet. So that's one approach which I think has, will bear fruit in the future. Today, though, what you can do if you want to, for example, set up an expert chatbot to provide first line services for your stakeholders, say, then pick an LLM that has relatively good credentials. I would say ChatGPT 5. Be very careful in the prompt to say, look, only use authoritative, reputable UK sources, and you can provide the URLs if you want in your particular area, the domain that you're creating the expert chatbot for, and you can ground it with information. So you can say, you can take the documents from your knowledge base within your organization that is kind of the represents your expertise, and you can say limit it to this and these reputable sources only. And that's about the best you can do to minimize hallucinations, factual inaccuracies, and just sort of it wanting to please, and so kind of making stuff up, because they are very, very keen to please. So yeah, there are things you can do today which are really, really important. And that's why I think, for example, the NHS are providing frontline therapy chatbots for, the waiting people who are on a very long waiting list for, seeing a human therapist. So these are effective, they are being used, and with the right sort of training and grounding and guardrails in place, then they're pretty good. So yeah, it's not a wild west out there, but you have to. It's a really thoughtful application of what we've got at the moment.
All right, thank you. And we have loads of questions as well in the Q&A. If folks want to upvote things so we know the priority, that's super helpful as well. It sounds what you said, Robin, sounds like an answer to this next question. So maybe we can start with this and get Alice and David to take on this as well. But this is from Amit, and it says, to be controversial, if the third sector should be working itself out of a job and the public is increasingly using Gen AI, is it our moral obligation to get chatbots to be as useful as possible, to work ourselves out of the job? I guess, yeah. Initial thoughts on that for Robin?
Yes is the answer, I would say. I mean, charities actually should have a goal, a mission to be out of work, because our services are no longer needed, because it's built into, society, social delivery, whatever it might be. So yeah, that's kind of the ultimate goal anyway. But yeah, so there's another company that I work for that provides workplace wellbeing software, and there's nothing more important than getting the right accommodations or adjustments in place, dealing with mental health, and the broadest gamut of people's needs within the workplace. And our expert chatbot, we feel, does a fantastic job. We've put a lot of thought into it. We hope that it would answer people's key queries on adjustments that they might need if they've shared their particular challenges in the workplace, circumstances at home that might be impacting on the workplace, but also what are their rights, because we pointed at all the right legislation and everything. So, what are my rights as a, pregnant, person in my 40s or whatever it might be. So yeah, we're really confident that it's providing an absolute tip-top service, and we would love for that to just be the be-all and end-all. But you need to have other things like adjustment tracking and audit trails and stuff like that. So it has to have a broader product around it. But we're really impressed with it, and yeah, I think that could be how things will pan out in the future.
Interesting. David, I don't know if you want to jump in. I know Amnesty's done some thinking about this. Like, should be is it our moral obligation, I suppose, to get chatbots to be as useful as possible? If so, at what cost? I know you sort of think about like the broader sector costs. Is there a limit?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. absolutely agree with much of what Robin said. I think it depends on the mission and the aim of your organization that you're working for. One thing that we, I guess there's a few things that I want to touch on here. First is the kind of structural dependency. I mean, we've seen numerous cases of outages, one recently this week with AWS, and we should think about how that might shape society if frontline public service delivery is mediated through technology and that is the only offering. What does that do to the kind of shape of society, and what about how do we think about the reliance on big tech and our structural dependence on them to deliver kind of things that really impact people's everyday life. So I know I'm talking at kind of a macro scale here, but I think it's important to acknowledge these factors before and challenge some of the narratives that AI is inevitable, and think through some of those thornier questions. And I think AI is often presented as a panacea to many of the problems we've seen, in areas that I work in, where it's been integrated within public service delivery. That's often done through a kind of austerity framing that will provide cost efficiencies, and there've been huge problems with the widespread adoption of technology in frontline service delivery. And I'm more than happy to share some of the work that we and other partners and journalists have done in this space. So I think, whilst I do agree that obviously we want, where chatbots are integrated, we want them to be safe for the end users, and acknowledge that many organizations are turning to these kind of solutions and digital solutions, and that they do bring some upside, but also thinking about the structural factors that are going on behind the scenes of why are these technologies being adopted, under what backdrop, and what are the kind of narratives at play, particularly around the kind of inevitability of kind of artificial intelligence solutions to many problems which might require other solutions that are structural in nature.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting counterbalance. And again, it's just such a thorny and difficult topic. We are coming up to time. I'm going to give you each 30 seconds just to give your a closing piece of advice to those in the room. If you're just starting out, what should you be thinking about in this space? But before I do that, I just want to thank everyone for joining today. Thank Alice, Robin, and David for their time. I know we didn't get to all of the questions. If you would like us to do more events like this, please fill in our feedback form. Put that in the chat. That helps us understand what you want to see and how we can help you do your work better. So please do fill that in. We look at the data. And thank you lastly to the folks at Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the Insight Infrastructure team for giving us the space to have this conversation. So in the last kind of 30 seconds each, what's one thing you want the folks in the room to take away today in their thinking about Gen AI use? Alice, I'll start with you.
Cool. Firstly, don't ever eat a mushroom that you've identified through Gen AI tools at the moment. They are some dodgy stuff out there. Secondly, talk to staff, find out what their emotional feelings about AI are. Go through the process of developing a strategy. It's really important. Try stuff out. Make sure you have guardrails in place before you do so, but allow people to experiment and test in a safe way. Find out how it really works for you. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. And Robin, closing thoughts.
Yeah. Just to echo what David said earlier about having humans at the center of it, and ideally diverse humans. So you will have a diverse workforce, as Alice just said. Talk to your teams, your colleagues. They will be diverse. Go to your ERGs or your SIGs, where diversity is being represented, and ask them about what you're doing with AI, so that they are well represented in the process. In the testing process, crucially. And also garner feedback from your diverse stakeholders or customers, because it's really, really important that after you've done all due diligence and you put something out live, that you garner feedback. And most of the, if we're talking about an expert chatbot to help deliver your services, most of those platforms give you the option of having a feedback button right there on the UI. So don't turn that off. keep that on so people can provide feedback, even if it's just a thumbs up and a thumbs down, but ideally turn on that feedback button and so that people can give you more fine grained information, and that then can feed back into the training process.
Super. And then lastly, David, any final thoughts?
Just to echo everything Alice and Robin just said, and I guess in addition, acknowledge the opportunities, but also think a lot about the structures behind these technology companies. Think a lot about how the tools are developed, and then set out the red lines and the policies that will work for you as an organization. But yeah, important to keep that kind of structural view in place as well.
Thank you all again, and thank you so much to the so many people who joined us today. We'll share the recording, and hopefully we can have a follow-up conversation to tackle some of the questions we didn't get to. Thank you, David, Robin, and Alice for your time today, and thank you everyone for your questions. Enjoy the rest of your afternoons.